They want to become a policeman or policewoman because they want to have an impact. And people start thinking about leaving the profession because they feel that they can't cope with the situations they face without the support of their organization.
Hello and welcome to ESCP Edge, the video podcast series that brings you insights from ESCP professors at the forefront of business research. My name's Nick Taylor, and today I'm joined by Kerstin Alfes, Professor of Organization and Human Resources Management at ESCP. Kerstin, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Nick.
Why don't we start by just talking about the sort of research you do and tell us a little bit more about yourself.
I'm a professor for Organization and Human Resources Management at ESCP's campus in Berlin. And my research focuses on a very simple but very profound question. One, do people engage in work in a way that is productive, but at the same time healthy and sustainable? And what I find fascinating about work is that a lot of times we think work is only about the salary that we get at the end of the month or the tasks that people complete. But for many people, work is more than just that. It's a source of identity, is an experience of belonging to the team, to a bigger group, is an opportunity for them to create meaning to something bigger, to have an impact. And therefore, work for many of us has different sources that keeps us motivated and that gets us out in the bed in the morning and get to work.
So why do we get out of bed in the morning? What are some of the surprising things beyond just the salary we get at the end of the month?
When we do our research, there are two important factors that come up. The first one is a sense of belonging and wanting to be part of something. So people get up in the morning and they go to work because they like their colleagues, they have friends at work, they like to support their line manager. So they want to go to work because they have a good relationship with their line manager. And then the second big factor why people get up in the morning and come to work is because they want to make an impact. And one of the stories that I encountered at the start of my career is I was doing research in London and I was talking to a waste collector at that point of time, and I asked him, where do you find meaning in your work and why do you come up, where do you get to work in the morning? And he explained to me that he felt he had one of the most important jobs that existed in London, because if he wouldn't get up and wouldn't collect the waste, the city started to smell, our visitors would be upset, citizens would be upset, and he felt that his work was full of meaning and purpose. And that made me realize at that point of time that work for many people, for many professions, for many occupations is more than just a salary. People often see bigger things behind their job, even in jobs where stereotypically we might not immediately see that connection.
Now, I've seen you've done quite a lot of research into productivity and thriving at work, but actually not just how thriving drives business results for companies, but how thriving can actually become something slightly toxic in a workplace. Can you explain that idea to us?
Yes, of course. Thriving in general is a state where we feel highly energetic at work and when we feel that we learned something from the work that we're doing. So from that perspective, thriving is great. Research tells us that people who thrive, they perform better, they go the extra mile, they have better relationships with their colleagues, they're very satisfied, they are innovative, they're creative. So lots of positive outcomes when people thrive at work. What research has so far ignored is that thriving needs a healthy sense of self-regulation. So when we thrive at work, we are full on. And then after a period of thriving, we need to recover. So we need self-regulation that tells us, hey, now let's take a pause, let's recover, and then go back into the next cycle of thriving. So healthy ups and flows, I would describe it. What research has not focused on so far is the question, what happens when people do not have that sense of self-regulation? And this is where our research comes in. We looked at people with ADHD who usually struggle with self-regulation, and we found that thriving for them was a lot more complex. On the one hand, thriving brought them to performance. So they performed very well. That gave them a boost in terms of their self-esteem. They enjoyed the work that they were doing, but because they lacked the ability to self-regulate, it turned into an excessive cycle where they would continue to perform. It gave them boosts of self-esteem. They continued to perform excessively and over time ignored things like their own health, their own well-being, the well-being of their family. Some of the stories they told us was very heartbreaking, saying that they had sleepless nights over months, that they had injuries, that they had back pain, that they had depression, that they had burnout. And still, despite all those health symptoms, they were unable to stop the mode of thriving and performing because they enjoyed it so much.
Is this something that's post-1980s or post the kind of digital era, or is that something you could have found in the 50s and 60s with workers?
It's something that we could have found in the 50s and 60s with workers. Lack of self-regulation has always been something that has been present. But what we see nowadays is that an increasing attention on people whose minds maybe operate differently. So the research lens from that perspective has opened to look at the workforce in a more segmented way or in a more diverse way. So now, rather than assuming everybody functions the same way, we look at people where we assume maybe they function a little bit differently. And this is then where we carry out our research. This was a project that was 3 years ago, and this is where we derive our findings from.
Given those findings, are there takeaways for human resources professionals, for people managers at work, for every manager? How do we respond to this in order to get the productivity a business needs without burning out our staff or making work unpleasant for some or all of our employees?
Yes, of course, very important takeaways. Employees who lack self-regulation, they cannot stop the cycle by themselves. So we need human resource managers, or more ideally, line managers, to actually stop that cycle, to talk to people, to tell them you need to recover, to force them to take breaks. And one way to force them to take breaks is also to tell them how much we appreciate their work and how much we recognize the effort that they put into our work, so that they realize that they get the rewarding recognition, but at the same time, the pauses that they need to break the excessive cycle of performance. And therefore, if you are a manager, if you see your employees regularly responding to emails at 3 o'clock in the morning, or getting up at 4 o'clock of the morning, or not taking any breaks during weekends and evenings, while that might sound great from an employee delivers the performance perspective, in the long run, it's actually quite detrimental for the employee, but also for the organization. So don't take the performance for granted, intervene and ask questions.
I wonder if, therefore, managers should not reward the employees who are going that extra mile.
Absolutely. It's important to reward such behavior when it happens, let's say, on a project. Infrequently, because then you really appreciate a person going the extra mile. But if you create a norm around that, a norm around working late or getting up early or working through weekends, that's when you create an unhealthy and potentially toxic culture where people feel, hey, in order to get a praise from my boss, I need to work at unhealthy patterns. And therefore, some small praise is fine, but creating the norm, this is where the dangerous part starts.
Do you think, and I imagine this might be something you find more in certain careers, careers that are traditionally involve long hours and very, very hard work, but then potentially not, because you did say you've done some research into people with much more entry-level blue-collar careers. I wondered if there were specific industries where this was more prevalent, and whether, in fact, you could find some sort of impact in the performance of businesses. For instance, I guess what I'm trying to say is a business that burns out all its employees, can you point at one and say, well, this business is great, but they're churned through people, and the amount they burn out actually will impact their bottom line, if not now, then soon?
We definitely see industries where that work rhythm is more the norm, like consultancy, project-based environments, investment banking. These are typical industries where companies ask a lot of employees and where we see that people suffer from this in the long term. One of the big problems that we face is that it's on the short term, it really boosts and helps the company to perform better. But then what are the implications if I work unhealthy patterns in 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, where people might have changed organization? This is something that is very difficult to get evidence about. But we see, I've recently read studies on CEOs, that there is actually quite a long-term effect of health implications for CEOs where, it comes visible when they're 60, 65, so long after their career, where you realize that maybe they asked too much during the course of their life from a health perspective.
I've also seen you've done research on the idea of belonging at work. That's not a phrase I often hear from human resources professionals. Can you tell me what that idea of belonging adds to your research and what you find there?
As human beings, we have a need to belong into groups, into a wider system. And traditional work relationships, they are centered around the idea that the employee belongs into a team and that the employee belongs into an organization where he or she would stay for a relatively long period of time. Our research is focused on employees who are not usually having traditional, long, stable work relationships, for example, freelancers in the gig economy. And we were interested in finding out, do people who don't necessarily have that connection over a long period of time and who are not able to build up a connection over a long period of time, do they also experience a sense of belonging at work? And that's exactly what we found, is that freelancers, even though they decide to stay outside the organization for different purposes or for different reasons, they still experience a sense of belonging, but the belonging they experience only to their teams. So in that sense, our research actually reveals a quite interesting tension. On the one hand, they purposefully say, I want to be an outsider to the organization. I don't want to get involved in organizational politics. I don't want to go to events that my organization hosts. But at the same time, I'm quite willing to engage on behalf of my team. So I'm supporting them in the evening, in extra hours. I'm helping them to succeed. I show personal support to my team members. And our research looks at how freelancers, for example, manage that contradiction between staying an outsider in one part of their life, work life, and then being an insider in another part of their work life.
Again, what are the implications for a manager? I mean, I don't know. It seems like post-COVID, there's a lot more people who have a gig economy style relationship to work. I don't know, maybe you could tell us whether the amount of freelancers has gone up in the past 5 years. And I wondered what the impacts for managers were, and actually for companies, whether a company filled with freelancers ultimately performed slightly worse, or whether there were this sense of belonging overcame that and so companies with lots of freelancers performed just as well as any other.
The number of freelancers is on the rise in the global economy, so we can clearly see that. And in terms of performance, we actually know that freelancers can demonstrate their best performance when they stay outside the organization, like as an outsider, but at the same time feel and build a connection to the team. So as an organization that is filled with freelancers, I would always suggest, don't try to force your freelancers into employment relationships. The freelancers that we spoke to, they were quite alienated by such behaviors, like when the organization wanted to really kind of get them on board as employees. But at the same time, try to build connections or try to build pathways through which those freelancers can build connections to the team. So from an organizational perspective, you get the best performance if you keep them at distance, but allow your team to integrate them.
That made me think about another thing that you've written about, which is this idea of paradoxical leadership. Again, I think it's based on this idea of tension at work. Can you explain that to us?
Of course. Leadership, as organizations maybe in general, as we all in our life, we constantly face tensions. So leaders, on the one hand, they're supposed to empower people, give them autonomy, but then at the same time, they're supposed to give them role clarity. On the one hand, they're supposed to consider employees individually. Then on the other hand, they're supposed to take a look at finding collective practices, making sure that they create cohesion. Then on the one hand, they're supposed to foster stability. On the other hand, they're supposed to innovate and experiment. So you constantly have this duality in organizational life, and that creates tensions. And research has previously suggested that we need to adapt our leadership style based on the situation. So certain leaders might be more control focused, other leaders might be more empowerment focused. And the idea of paradoxical leadership suggests that leaders should actually try to combine both in their daily life. So they should try to give autonomy, but at the same time clear boundaries. They should try to foster collective sense of belonging, while at the same time showing individual consideration for people. And it's another concept that is great for many people, but not for everyone. So what we have demonstrated in our research is that for employees who are cognitively flexible, who are agile, they resonate with a paradoxical leader. They are able to make sense of what he or she is doing in their daily work. But if we've got employees who lack that cognitive flexibility, then having a paradoxical leader who gives two different things at the same time can actually be quite confusing, and over time leads employees to burnout, have health-related problems, and experience lower levels of job satisfaction.
I wonder if there are geographical differences in this, because this idea of giving managers the training they need and the space and the support and really encouraging them not just to focus on profit and loss KPIs, but on staff retention and these other things. Is that something that Europe does better than America? Is it something that China does well? Is it something that Norway does best in the world?
We see cultural differences in how people manage and what is supposed to be a good management behavior. I would say that a lot of what we're discussing here today is Western driven, in terms that we look at managers in the area where we are living and where we're teaching and researching. At the same time, I don't necessarily think that all that we're discussing is culturally influenced, but a lot depends on the values and the philosophy of organizations. So I'm working with quite a few organizations outside Europe, and you sometimes see that the values of the CEO matter a lot more than the culture and the environment within which the organization is situated.
And that's the same for even a very, very large company where you have a dispersed workforce and the CEO might not come into contact with 80% of the organization.
Yes, because the mindset, the values, the signals that the CEO sends, they are so powerful. The CEO is a role model. So what he or she role models is transferred through the whole organization. And therefore, even though a CEO in a large organization doesn't actually see the employees on a daily basis, and some of them never be in touch with, what he says, what he does, what she says, what she does is super powerful and will be merged by the second line of leadership and the third line of leadership. So the values, the mindset of the CEO matters more in shaping the culture than anything else.
Now, I know you mentioned there that your research can be focused on Western companies because this is where you are, but I know you did a large piece of research that was derived from Australian data. Do you want to tell me about that? I think you were working with Australian frontline police forces and responders.
Absolutely. The research we did in Australia is so powerful because policemen, they work in emotionally and physically demanding situations. And what we found is that they often join the profession because they have this huge intrinsic motivation. They want to become a policeman or policewoman because they want to have an impact. But then during their work life, they experience negative things such as violence, for example. And what our research shows is that in those situations, if the organization doesn't support them, doesn't provide a constructive work environment, the initial engagement becomes quite fragile and volatile. And people start thinking about leaving the profession that they joined for the very good reasons at the start because they feel that they can't cope with the situations they face without the support of their organization. So in that sense, the research is powerful because it shows that on one hand, it needs people's intrinsic need to work in a specific profession, but then that needs to be complemented by an organizational infrastructure that supports them specifically when engagement is challenged.
So what does that research tell us from an HR perspective? How should HR professionals manage people in highly challenging situations like police forces and other demanding professions?
It's very important to have supportive HR practices. And what I mean by this is rather than saying, hey, we are a tough culture, let's go on with it, it's part of the job, just continue working, or ignoring that violence happens, which is the traditional way of working in such professions, let's acknowledge that violence happens, and let's acknowledge that violence is a burden for employees who either experience it themselves or who witness it when it happens to others, like colleagues or the public. Have a psychologist who people can go to, who they openly can talk to. Give people training, resilience training, first responder training. Give people tools that actually enables them to openly discuss their experience with violence rather than having to deal with it by themselves. Because if they have to deal with it by themselves, we see that people start to deny, they start to make fun of it, they start to ignore that something bad happens, and over time that really drains their energy.
Have you looked at any other smaller groups in other cultures that are facing very hostile or violent environments?
I'm currently working on a very big study on hope in the Lebanon, and it's very sad to say, but it's more current than ever. We are looking at people, we're interviewing people, and we're trying to understand how do people in a country that has had so many traumas over time, how do they actually keep a sense of hope for a better future? And one of the things, it's very preliminary stages still, but one of the things that we find is that, again, the collective, the sense of belonging, the people around them, that this gives them a source of hope. And we hope that through that research we can make an impact by also looking at how people work and live in situations that are a lot more difficult than the ones that we face in a more Western environment.
What other areas are you hoping to look into in the future? If you had a blank calendar and you could look into any field in your specialism, what sort of things would you look at?
As I'm moving more and more into looking at like minority groups and engagement with minority groups, one of the dream for the future would be to carry out research in parts of the world that have not been researched so far. So LGBTQ experiences in Arabic countries is one of the things that I'm truly interested in. Then how the notion of disability is something that changes across cultures, something that I'd be interested in. And also then hope and engagement in parts of the world that have more difficult work environments than we have.
You look into so many different groups and so many different types of organizations and businesses. Do you find it hard to translate your findings into practical things that HR professionals can use at work?
One of my key reasons that motivate me in my research is trying to make it accessible to practitioners. So I don't want to live in an ivory tower and like do research in my ivory tower and then nobody reads and uses my work. What's very important for me is that my research is accessible. So with my research team, we develop guidelines, we develop tools, we develop handbooks, we develop checklists that organizations and line managers or human resource managers can use in their daily work to create a better work environment for the people that we're researching. So research, from my perspective, is not something for professors and their research teams. It's something that should be made accessible for a wider audience, because only if people use what we research about, it can actually have a lasting impact in organizations.
And do you find it hard to find the organizations to partner with for this kind of research? Are you interested in finding more of organizations who'd like to work with you on your research?
We're always interested in finding more organizations. So if anyone listens to the podcast is fascinated by the topics that we're discussing, get in touch with me. Sometimes we partner with organizations to test tools, to test guidelines. Sometimes we partner with organizations to actually conduct research. And I know that many organizations face similar challenges as the ones that we have discussed today. So for them, it could be like a win-win situation where they get like hands-on research that they can directly transfer to practice.
Kerstin Alfes, Professor of Organization and Human Resources Management at ESCP. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
This has been ESCP Edge. Thanks for joining us. Join us next time for another fascinating conversation with an ESCP professor.